This is a brief overview lecture to help you get ready for the readings and topics that we're going to be covering during Unit 2 of Comms 5314. The overall focus in Unit 2 is on communicating with other experts. And even though we're doing a quite diverse set of readings, they are united by the question that's posed on this slide. What are the theories and practices that sustain effective communication across and within boundaries in health, science, and technology? So this is one question I will ask you to consider as you move through the readings assigned in this unit. Often, when we think of science communication, we think only about experts communicating to the public. And there is, of course, a great deal of research to show why that is important. But in this unit, we expand our definition of science communication to include a focus on the need for effective communication among experts, both across and within disciplines, as well as the public science communication that is more often emphasized. These are some of the boundaries that will be addressed in the articles that are assigned during this unit. The first category encompasses communication that occurs among experts who come from different disciplines, but also communication between experts and non-experts. The second category encompasses boundaries that arise because of differences among human beings, such as gender, race, and culture. The third category encompasses differences or borders that exist among people within disciplines or organizations that might look to be unified from the outside. The readings for Week 5 address the kinds of communication that occur across disciplinary boundaries. Pay close attention to these readings because they introduce the concept of boundary objects, which will form the foundation of your brief report number 2 assignment. In your assignment guidelines, I link to a website that I think offers a practical and useful definition. I encourage you to view this website on your own, but basically to summarize, here's the relevant language. Boundary objects are objects that both inhabit several communities of practice and satisfy the information requirements of each of them. Boundary objects aren't necessarily physical constructs. They can include symbols or metaphors with the power to speak to different communities of practice. Boundary objects allow different groups to share common meanings and different perspectives. These are just a few examples. For each of these concepts, data, disease, and style, I encourage you to think about the different meanings these concepts can have in different disciplines, and more importantly, about the different functions that they serve across disciplines. For instance, the concept of disease plays a different function for a pathologist who studies cells under a microscope than for an epidemiologist who studies how organisms flow through and infect populations. Yet, these specialists from different disciplines are able to exchange information to communicate in a meaningful and productive manner because disease serves a boundary object as a boundary object between them. Similar observations apply to the other two examples I've offered here, but I'll let you fill in the details on those other two examples. On this slide, I'm showing an example that illustrates another way of thinking about boundary objects. Rather than highlight general concepts such as data, this slide shows a specific document that can be understood as a boundary object. This is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, usually just called the DSM. This is a document published by the American Psychiatric Association, but it is an authoritative source of information for numerous stakeholders, including psychiatrists, psychologists, other mental health professionals, insurance companies, and patients. Also in Week 5, I'm asking you to listen to an episode of a podcast called Monster Talk. This is a great podcast for this unit because its creators have done an incredible job producing science communication that has attracted a wide audience. Some of their episodes get as many as 35 to 40,000 listeners. Also, it just so happens the podcast creators will be visiting Lubbock at the end of February. More details on that forthcoming. For Week 6, you're assigned some texts on gender, race, and culture in the STEM professions. On this slide, I'm highlighting one of the texts that you'll be reading an excerpt from. This is a report published in 2018 by the National Academies Committee in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Coinciding to some extent with the Me Too movement, this report tries to identify and address some of the underlying reasons for the persistent and pervasive problem of sexual harassment in the STEM professions. It includes some potentially groundbreaking recommendations, some of which have already been implemented. For instance, NSF announced in September 2018 that institutions receiving funding are now required to report any investigators on NSF projects who have been found to commit acts of sexual assault or harassment. To supplement the assigned readings, I want to offer an example from my own research. This is covered in my book, From Hysteria to Hormones. It's going to seem a little off topic, but hopefully it'll all come together here pretty soon. It's a 2015 study whose results are reported in the article shown here. The study's purpose was to test how women's responses to stressful situations varies in response to where they are at in the menstrual cycle. The technique that's used to induce stress is a commonly used instrument called the Montreal Imaging Stress Task, or MIST. As it is used in this study, a combination of algorithms and experiment personnel harassing the women while they try to perform is used to induce, quote, moderate psychosocial stress and, quote, social evaluative threat. So one of the things, I don't want to get into too much detail here, but one of the things that happens during the study is they're given these math problems and they're told that they need to get a certain amount correct, but then the algorithm is set so they can't get that amount correct. And then on top of it all is the experimenters periodically come in the room and read a pre-designed script that tells them that they're really screwing up. So anyway, it simulates a situation in which women are treated really badly. And then two methods were used to measure and evaluate participants' stress responses: the more objective measure of MRI testing and the more subjective measure of self-reporting. This is a close-up view of the portion of this study that I find most distressing. This shows one of the, quote, subjective measures that are used to evaluate these women's responses to stress. You can see it consists of a series of words asking the participant to judge the extent to which she is experiencing each of these feelings, both before and after the test. If she gives a low rating on the feelings that are deemed more negative, like angry or unhappy, she will be judged as having a low distress response to psychosocial stress. But if she gives a high rating on these negative feelings, she will be judged as having a high distress response to psychosocial stress. So if we think about some similar situations that might play out in the professional setting, we might ask questions like the ones I'm showing on this slide. I'm sure many of you can think of a situation in which you or someone you know has been bullied or harassed. What's the typical response? Usually no one wants to complain, right? Why? Because they fear repercussions. Now think about the value judgments implicit in the Albert et al. Study, the one that we just looked at. Which type of response is going to be evaluated positively, and which will be evaluated negatively? So again, I realize this was a bit of a tangent, but sometimes I like to find ways to bring in examples from my own research, and I think this one might be a useful backdrop to the readings that you're assigned for week 6. What I'm trying to do with this week's readings is get to the idea that these boundaries of gender, race, and culture are not just boundaries that exist on the surface. They are divides and differences that are woven into the very fabric of the academic and professional setting. And, giving the example of that study of women's responses to stress, I think is one way to show just how deeply ingrained some of these differences are and what we are working against when we're trying to implement change. And finally, for week 7, it's all about winning, right? The winning of arguments. For this week, we read some articles that report research on rhetoric and argumentation as it occurs in health, science, and technology organizations and disciplines. What unites the readings for this week is examining situations in which experts, whether from different disciplines or not, argue with each other within the context of a single organization. The first two readings examine some argumentative action within medicine. Specifically, these examine two situations in which medical experts from different disciplinary specializations engage in argument across the boundaries that these disciplinary differences create within the same organization. These two articles use concepts from rhetorical theory to explicate the arguments that the authors are examining. In the Krista Teston article, you'll want to make sure you understand the concept of genre in the way she uses it in that article. In the article by Graham and Herndl, make sure you understand the concept of stasis. The third reading examines cross-disciplinary arguments unfolding, or sometimes reaching a standstill, across disciplinary lines within a different kind of organization. In this case, it's NASA. Some of the concepts in this article, such as professional identity, are going to sound familiar from earlier assigned readings. But I find it fascinating how the differences in professional identity play out in this article. I think it's an excellent example to illustrate how strong individuals' sense of professional identity can be, and how this can impede innovation even within an organization. I have seen similar situations play out in the academy, although one of the things I absolutely love about our college, the College of Media and Communication, is that we have a culture that encourages innovation across disciplinary boundaries, both within the college and across the university as a whole. Okay, and so that's it for your Unit 2 lecture. I urge you to start thinking about brief report assignment number 2, even though that's not due for a little while. I'm hoping you're going to find the readings, especially for the first week in this unit, are going to help you come to terms with this concept of the boundary object. It's a challenging one. I think when I taught this class last spring, I think in the early phases, this was a very challenging document to write and kind of a challenging assignment. But I hope you'll have fun with it, and I think for most students, once they got to the end of it, and once they figured out the boundary object they were going to write about, I think it turned out to be kind of a fun little assignment. So anyway, as always, I hope you enjoy the readings, and I hope you will get in touch with me if any questions come up along the way, either about the readings or about the assignments. Thanks, and have a great week.